saw those cases against James Comey and Letitia James tossed out, but do you still have faith in Lindsay Halligan?
Oh, she's great. I think she's great. They got out on a technicality, and you'll see what happens from here on. But if you look at the actual charges, I think anybody that looks at it very fairly would say, boy, are they guilty. So let's see what happens over the next week. You know, the court didn't say you couldn't bring the case, re-bring the case, or appeal the case. So they have a lot of options. They're going to call the shot. I'm not calling the shot. But Lindsay's a very talented lawyer, actually.
Do you have any reaction to Mayor Bowser announcing she's not running for re-election in D.C.?
Well, I got along with her very well. I liked her. We worked together. D.C. is now a safe community. It's a great community. You people know it better than I do because you live there. But D.C. is now safe. The restaurants are booming. The place is booming. We have no crime. And we did that all in a period of 3 or 4 weeks and then made it better and better and better.
How was your call with the Japanese Prime Minister?
Great. It was great. I had a great talk. I have a very good relationship with her. I also had a very good talk with President Xi of China. And I think that part of the world is doing fine.
Okay, so this is absolutely wild, and I need you to pay attention, because what just happened between President Trump and the federal courts is unlike anything we have seen in modern American history. A federal judge is now actively pursuing a contempt investigation against Trump administration officials. And we are talking about potentially dragging senior members of this administration into court to answer for allegedly defying direct judicial orders. This is not some routine legal dispute that lawyers argue about in boring courtrooms while everyone ignores it. This is not some technical procedural matter that only affects people who went to law school. This is a full-blown constitutional confrontation between the executive branch and the judiciary, and Trump is absolutely furious about it in a way that tells you just how serious this has become. Let me set the scene for you because this story is moving fast, and most people do not understand how serious it has gotten in just the last few days. U.S. District Judge James Boasberg in Washington, D.C. is pressing forward with what legal experts are calling a rare and high-stakes contempt inquiry against Trump officials. But before we go any further, real quick, let's be honest. You can't really trust mainstream media anymore. That's why we built Pump Politics, to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines, join our free newsletter. We'll send the news straight to your inbox every day. Just click the link in the description to join. And if you just want to support what we're doing, join us. Be part of the community that actually cares about the truth. All right, let's get back to the video.
Trade. I spoke to President Xi about a lot of things, but trade and buying our farm products, and he said he agreed with me. I think he's gonna very much surprise you on the upside. I asked him, I'd like you to buy it a little faster. I'd like you to buy more, and he's more or less agreed to do that. I think we will be pleasantly surprised by the actions of President Xi. I have a good relationship, great relationship with him. I like him, he likes me. I'm going to be going there in April. I guess you'll all be going with me, but I'm going to be going to China in April.
This week we saw those cases against James Comey and Letitia James tossed out, but do you still have faith in Lindsay Halligan?
Oh, she's great. I think she's great. They got out on a technicality, and you'll see what happens from here on. But if you look at the actual charges, I think anybody that looks at it very fairly would say, boy, are they guilty. So let's see what happens over the next week. You know, the court didn't say you couldn't bring the case, re-bring the case, or appeal the case. So they have a lot of options. They're going to call the shot. I'm not calling the shot.
The issue at the center of all this involves flights that took migrants to El Salvador. Flights that allegedly happened after the judge had already issued an order blocking those exact removals. The administration apparently went ahead and did it anyway while the planes were in the air. And now the judge wants answers about who made that call and whether they deliberately ignored his instructions. He is not letting this go, and he is demanding accountability from the people who were responsible for those decisions. And here is where it gets really intense. Judge Boasberg has ordered written declarations from all the officials involved, and those are due by December 5th. He is demanding detailed statements explaining exactly what happened and who knew what and when they knew it. He wants names and timelines and a full accounting of the decision-making process that led to those flights going forward. But that might just be the beginning, because he is also weighing whether to demand live testimony in his courtroom where officials would have to answer questions under oath. We are talking about the possibility of senior Trump officials, potentially including Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem, being hauled before a federal judge to explain themselves while the whole country watches. Can you believe this is actually happening right now? The administration's lawyers are trying to argue that they did not actually violate the order because the planes had already left U.S. territory when the judge's ruling came down. They are saying the migrants were already removed. So technically, they did not defy anything because there was nothing left to comply with by the time the order took effect. But Judge Boasberg is not buying that argument, and he says he needs to determine whether there was a willful violation of a clear court directive. In other words, did these officials know exactly what they were doing, and did they do it anyway because they figured they could get away with it, or because they wanted to create a situation where they could claim technical compliance while actually ignoring what the court was trying to accomplish? And Trump? Well, Trump is doing exactly what you would expect him to do in this situation. He is raging on social media and attacking the judiciary and calling the judge names and demanding his impeachment. He has already called Judge Boasberg a troublemaker in earlier posts, and his allies have been accusing the judge of overreach and filing misconduct claims against him to try to discredit him before he can rule on the contempt question. But here is the thing that should concern everyone regardless of which side of the political aisle you sit on. Another judge in a separate case recently cited one of Trump's Truth Social posts as actual evidence of intent to defy a court order. They are literally using his own words against his administration in these legal proceedings because his public statements reveal his attitude toward judicial authority. This is not an isolated incident either. And this is the part that tells you how big this clash has become between the Trump administration and the federal judiciary. A Politico analysis published just yesterday found that more than 220 different judges around the country have now rejected parts of Trump's mass detention and deportation policies. 220 judges. Let that number sink in for a moment. That is not a few activist judges in liberal cities like Trump wants you to believe when he attacks the courts. That is a massive wall of judicial resistance spanning the entire country. Judges appointed by presidents of both parties looking at what this administration is doing and saying, no, this is not legal, and you cannot do this regardless of how important you think border security is. So, what we are witnessing right now is the collision of an unstoppable force and an immovable object, and something has to give eventually. Trump believes he has the authority to secure the border and remove migrants by whatever means necessary. And he is treating court orders like suggestions that he can ignore when they get in his way, or work around through clever timing and technical arguments. Meanwhile, federal judges across the country are saying, hold on, we are a nation of laws, and the executive branch does not get to just do whatever it wants, regardless of what the Constitution and the courts say about limits on presidential power. The contempt probe against Trump officials might be the moment where this whole confrontation comes to a head, and we find out whether courts can actually enforce their rulings against a president who does not want to comply. Are you kidding me? This is the story that everyone should be watching right now because it goes to the very heart of how our government works. Alright, so let us really dig into what is happening here because I think a lot of people hear about court cases and contempt proceedings and their eyes glaze over immediately. It sounds like boring legal stuff that does not affect their everyday lives, just lawyers arguing about procedures and jurisdictions while normal people go about their business. But I need you to understand that what is unfolding right now between President Trump and the federal judiciary is going to shape this country for years to come in ways that will affect every single American. This is about whether we still have a system of checks and balances where courts can actually constrain presidential power, or whether we have moved into a new era where the president can simply ignore judges when he does not like what they tell him to do. So let me break down why this contempt probe matters so much, and why you should care about what happens next, even if you have never paid attention to legal news before in your life. Because this is not just about some migrants on planes to El Salvador. This is about the fundamental question of whether court orders mean anything at all when the President of the United States decides he does not want to follow them. This is about whether we are still a country where the rule of law applies to everyone, including the most powerful person in the government, or whether we have become something else entirely. First, let us talk about how we got here and what Judge Boasberg's case is actually about so you understand the full context of this confrontation. The administration has been pursuing an aggressive policy of detention and deportation. That is no secret, and Trump has been very open about making immigration enforcement a top priority of his second term since the day he took office. Part of that policy involves removing migrants to other countries, including El Salvador. Under various legal authorities, the administration claims it has based on emergency powers and other statutes. But various civil rights groups and immigration advocates have challenged these removals in court, arguing that the administration is violating due process rights and other legal protections that migrants are entitled to under American law and international treaties. Judge Boasberg issued an order in this case that blocked certain removals, while the legal challenges played out in his courtroom. That is a pretty standard thing for courts to do in cases like this. You issue a temporary restraining order or preliminary injunction to preserve the status quo while you figure out the underlying legal questions that will determine who ultimately wins the case. The idea is that you do not want irreversible harm to happen while the case is still being decided, because there would be no way to fix it later. Once someone is deported to another country, it becomes very difficult or impossible to undo that if you later determine the deportation was illegal. You cannot just snap your fingers and bring them back. But here is what allegedly happened. And this is what the contempt inquiry is trying to get to the bottom of through sworn declarations and potentially live testimony. 2 flights carrying migrants to El Salvador apparently went forward even though the judge had issued his order blocking exactly those kinds of removals. The administration's position is that the planes had already left U.S. territory by the time the order came down. So technically, they did not violate anything because the migrants were already removed and beyond the court's jurisdiction. They are basically saying the order came too late to stop what was already in motion, and they cannot be held responsible for something that was already done by the time they received the ruling. Judge Boasberg is not accepting that explanation at face value, and frankly, neither should anyone who cares about the rule of law and whether court orders actually mean anything in practice. He wants to know exactly what happened and when it happened and who made what decisions and why they made them when they did. Did officials know the order was coming and rush to get those planes in the air before it could take effect so they could claim technical compliance afterward? Did they deliberately time things to create a situation where they could argue they did not really violate anything while actually defying the spirit of what the court was trying to accomplish? These are the questions the contempt inquiry is designed to answer through a thorough investigation of the facts. And the stakes here are enormous, both legally and politically, because we are talking about unprecedented consequences if the judge finds willful violations occurred. If the judge determines that Trump officials willfully violated his order, he could refer them for criminal contempt proceedings. That would mean potential criminal charges against senior administration officials for ignoring a federal court, something that has not happened in modern American history. Think about what that would mean for the relationship between the executive branch and the judiciary going forward. Think about the precedent it would set for future administrations of both parties when they face court orders they disagree with. This is genuinely uncharted territory in modern American politics, and nobody knows exactly how it would play out. Now let us zoom out and look at the bigger picture, because this contempt probe is not happening in isolation. It is part of a much larger pattern of confrontation between Trump and the courts that has been building throughout his second term. The Politico analysis I mentioned earlier found that more than 220 judges have rejected parts of his detention and deportation policies since he took office. That is an absolutely staggering number when you think about it and what it means for how the judiciary views this administration's approach to the law. We are not talking about a handful of liberal judges in blue states trying to obstruct a Republican president for partisan reasons. We are talking about judges across the entire federal judiciary, many of them appointed by Republican presidents, including Trump himself, looking at what this administration is doing and concluding that it does not pass legal muster under the Constitution and existing statutes. And Trump's response to all this judicial resistance has been to attack the judges personally and accuse them of overreach, and essentially argue that courts should not be able to stop him from doing what he believes is necessary to secure the border and protect Americans. He has called for impeaching judges who rule against him as if that were a normal response to losing a court case. He has accused them of being partisan activists who are abusing their power to obstruct his agenda, and perhaps most significantly, he has signaled in various ways that he might simply ignore rulings he disagrees with because he believes his authority on immigration supersedes anything the courts might say. That last point is what makes the contempt probe so important, and why this particular case could be a turning point in American constitutional history. If Trump officials can defy court orders and face no consequences, what is to stop them from doing it again and again whenever they find judicial rulings inconvenient? What is to stop future administrations of either party from concluding that court orders are really just suggestions that can be ignored when politically convenient, or when the president feels strongly enough about an issue? The entire system of judicial review depends on the executive branch actually complying with what courts tell them to do. If that norm breaks down, we are in a constitutional crisis, whether anyone wants to call it that or not. But wait, there is even more happening right now that makes this story even more explosive and shows how far Trump is willing to push the boundaries of his authority. Just in the last couple of days, Trump announced he is going to permanently pause migration from what he called third world countries. This came right after a tragic shooting involving a National Guard member in Washington, D.C., And Trump is using that incident to justify even more aggressive immigration restrictions that go far beyond anything previous presidents have attempted. He is suspending asylum decisions and ordering reviews of green card policies and basically throwing the entire immigration system into chaos while daring the courts to stop him. And here is the thing. All of these new actions are going to face legal challenges too, just like everything else he has done on immigration so far. There are already over 220 judges who have rejected parts of his existing policies. Now he is going even further with actions that civil liberties groups are already calling unconstitutional and preparing lawsuits to challenge. So we are looking at even more court battles, even more judges potentially issuing orders against the administration, and even more opportunities for Trump officials to either comply with those orders or defy them and face contempt proceedings just like the one Judge Boasberg is currently conducting. Okay, so let us break this down into what it actually means, because I know there is a lot to process here, and these legal confrontations can feel overwhelming, even for people who try to follow the news closely. But these issues matter. They matter for how our government works, and they matter for whether we remain a country where the rule of law means something for everyone, including the president. So let me give you the key points you need to understand about this Trump versus the court showdown and why it could be the defining conflict of his second term. Point number one, we are watching a sitting president openly clash with the federal judiciary in ways that could trigger a genuine constitutional crisis if officials are actually held in contempt for defying court orders. This is not normal, and this is not how the system is supposed to work under our Constitution. When a federal judge issues an order, the executive branch is supposed to comply with that order while pursuing their appeals through proper legal channels if they disagree with it. You do not get to just ignore judges because you think their rulings are wrong or inconvenient, or because you believe your priorities are more important than following the law. The entire structure of American government depends on each branch respecting the legitimate authority of the other branches, even when they disagree about specific issues. What Trump and his administration appear to be doing is testing how far they can push before something breaks, and they face real consequences for their defiance. They are treating court orders as obstacles to be worked around, rather than binding legal directives that must be obeyed regardless of whether they like the outcome. They are timing deportation flights to happen before orders can take effect, so they can claim technical compliance afterward. They are making creative legal arguments about why their actions do not really violate what judges said, even when it is obvious what the courts were trying to accomplish. And when judges push back and demand accountability, Trump attacks them personally and calls for their impeachment and suggests they are illegitimate actors who should not be able to constrain presidential power on issues he cares about. This is a dangerous game because once you establish that the president can ignore courts when he wants to, you have fundamentally changed how American government works in ways that cannot easily be undone. Every future president will cite the precedent that Trump established. Every future administration will know they can defy judges and potentially get away with it if they are willing to absorb the political criticism. The courts will lose their ability to check executive overreach because their rulings will not mean anything in practice if the president can simply choose not to follow them whenever he feels strongly enough about an issue to take the risk. Point number two, Judge Boasberg's contempt inquiry represents the judiciary fighting back and trying to enforce its own authority against an administration that seems determined to steamroll over legal constraints whenever they get in the way. This is exactly what courts are supposed to do when the executive branch defies them. They are supposed to hold people accountable and impose consequences for violations of their orders. But it is extremely rare for this kind of direct confrontation to happen with a sitting administration, and the consequences could be historic if the judge follows through on his investigation and makes findings of contempt. If Boasberg determines that Trump officials willfully violated his order, he has several options available to him under the law. He could hold them in civil contempt, which would involve fines or other penalties designed to coerce compliance with his orders going forward. He could refer them for criminal contempt, which would involve actual prosecution and potential jail time for defying a court order in a willful manner. Either path would be extraordinary and unprecedented in modern American history. We would be talking about senior administration officials facing real legal consequences for ignoring a federal judge, something that simply has not happened before and would send shockwaves through the political and legal worlds. The administration is clearly trying to avoid that outcome by making technical arguments about timing and jurisdiction that they hope will give them legal cover for what happened. They want to convince the judge that whatever happened with those El Salvador flights, it was not really a violation of his order because of various legal technicalities about when the planes left and where the migrants were located. Maybe the planes left before the order took effect. Maybe the migrants were outside U.S. jurisdiction, so the order did not apply to them anymore. Maybe there was confusion about what the order actually required that explains any apparent non-compliance. But Boasberg is demanding sworn declarations from everyone involved, and he is reserving the option to require live testimony in his courtroom where he can ask follow-up questions. That means officials are going to have to put their statements under oath, where lying would itself be a serious crime that could result in prosecution. And if their technical arguments do not hold up under close scrutiny, if it turns out they knew exactly what they were doing and did it anyway because they thought they could get away with it, then the contempt finding becomes much more likely, and the consequences become very real very quickly. Point number 3, the fact that over 220 judges have rejected parts of Trump's immigration policies tells you this is not about one rogue judge or a few liberal activists on the bench trying to obstruct a Republican president for partisan reasons. This is systematic judicial resistance to an administration that keeps pushing past legal boundaries and testing the limits of what courts will tolerate. When that many judges across the country, judges appointed by presidents of both parties spanning decades of different administrations, keep ruling against you, at some point you have to ask whether maybe the problem is with what you are doing, rather than with the judges who keep telling you it is illegal. Trump wants to frame this as partisan obstruction by liberal elites who hate him and want to stop his agenda regardless of what the law actually says. He wants his supporters to believe that these judges are just activists in robes who are abusing their power to prevent him from securing the border and protecting Americans from criminals and terrorists. But the numbers simply do not support that narrative, no matter how many times he repeats it. 220 judges is way too many to dismiss as partisan actors all engaged in some coordinated conspiracy against one president. These are serious jurists who have looked at specific administration actions and concluded, based on the law and the Constitution and decades of legal precedent, that those actions are not legal. That is the judiciary doing exactly the job it is supposed to do in our system of government. Point number 4. Trump's response to this judicial resistance, attacking judges personally and suggesting he might ignore their rulings when he disagrees with them, sets a terrifying precedent for the future of American democracy, regardless of what you think about his immigration policies or border security priorities. You can agree with Trump that we need stronger border security. You can agree that the immigration system is broken and needs fixing. You can agree that previous administrations were too lax and that we need a tougher approach. But you should still be alarmed when a president suggests that courts have no authority to constrain his actions, and that judges who rule against him are illegitimate actors who should be impeached or ignored. The reason we have an independent judiciary is precisely so that unpopular decisions can be made without fear of retaliation from the political branches of government. Judges are supposed to rule based on the law, not based on what is politically popular or what the president wants or what will make them popular with one side or the other. When a president attacks judges for doing their jobs, when he calls for their impeachment over rulings he dislikes, he is trying to intimidate the judiciary into submission. He is trying to make judges afraid to rule against him because they know they will face personal attacks and political retribution and accusations of corruption or bias. That is not how a constitutional democracy is supposed to work, and it threatens the foundations of our system of government. And if Trump succeeds in cowing the judiciary into backing down, if judges start hesitating to rule against him because they fear the consequences for their careers and reputations, then we have lost something essential about what makes America different from authoritarian countries where courts are just tools of whoever holds power at the moment. So, where does this go from here, and what should you be watching for in the coming weeks? The contempt probe will play out over the next several weeks as the process moves forward. Officials will submit their sworn declarations by December 5th explaining their version of what happened. Boasberg will review those statements carefully and decide whether he needs live testimony to get to the truth. At some point, he will make a determination about whether contempt occurred and what the consequences should be for anyone he finds violated his orders. Meanwhile, Trump will keep pushing his immigration agenda and facing new legal challenges and attacking judges who rule against him. This is not going away anytime soon. This clash between Trump and the courts is going to define his second term and shape American politics for years to come, regardless of how the individual cases turn out. Either the judiciary successfully constrains presidential power and preserves the system of checks and balances that has defined American government for over 2 centuries, or Trump establishes a new precedent where presidents can ignore courts and face no real consequences as long as they are willing to take the political heat. The stakes could not be higher for the future of American democracy. Stay tuned because this constitutional showdown is just getting started, and the explosion has not happened yet.